Grace Walker's house was at the edge of the mountains. The stone walls were old and weathered, standing strong against the passing years. The wind from the valley carried the cold and a feeling of sadness, as if the world was changing. Grace Walker had lived there alone since her parents died in an accident 6 months ago. She was left to take care of herself, with no one else to help. Her house was simple, with old furniture and a hearth used many times. Grace Walker held on to these things because they reminded her of her family, especially her parents. The people in the village were kind, but kept their distance. They believed in taking care of themselves and didn't always offer help, even when they knew she was struggling. Some people suggested she go to a convent, a place where orphan girls could live. But Grace Walker didn't want to leave her home. It was the last piece of her family she had left. Life was hard, and the little garden behind her house didn't give her enough to eat. She barely had enough money left from selling the crops, and winter was coming. Grace Walker's father had always told her that strength comes from hard times, and that being honest was more important than anything else. Grace Walker remembered these words, and they gave her strength to keep going. One day, as Grace Walker was walking to the village, she found a worn leather wallet on the ground. She picked it up and opened it, finding more money than she had ever seen. But there was also an ID card inside with the name Richard Jonathan. Grace Walker knew that Richard Jonathan owned the local restaurant. He was a kind and hardworking man. She wasn't sure what to do. The money could help her survive through the winter, but she knew it wasn't right to keep it. After thinking for a moment, Grace Walker decided to return the wallet to him. That evening, Grace Walker went to the restaurant. The warm light from inside spilled out into the street, and the smell of food made her Elaine Benatak rumble. When she walked in, Richard looked up from his work. She handed him the wallet and explained where she found it. Richard smiled and thanked her. He was grateful, and Grace Walker felt good for doing the right thing. Richard asked if Grace Walker had any work. Grace Walker explained that she was looking for a job, but hadn't found one. Richard smiled again and said, "If you don't mind getting your hands dirty, I could use some help here." Grace Walker was surprised and happy. She hadn't expected this. She thanked Richard, and he told her to just call him by his first name. The next morning, Grace Walker woke up early, feeling excited and nervous. The cold air from the mountains slipped into her house, but she didn't mind. She put on a dress that belonged to her mother and left for the diner. When she arrived, Richard was already there, ready to show her what to do. He showed her where the food was kept and gave her tasks like cleaning the tables and organizing the pantry. At first, it felt like a lot to learn, but Grace Walker soon got the hang of it. By the end of the day, her hands were tired, but she felt proud of herself. The next few days were full of hard work, but Grace Walker was happy. She felt useful again. Richard was kind and often told her she was doing a great job. He said she reminded him of her parents, who were always hardworking and honest. One day, Richard gave Grace Walker an envelope with her first paycheck. It was more money than they had agreed upon, and Grace Walker was surprised. She told him there must have been a mistake, but Richard said it wasn't. "You remind me of my daughter," he said, his voice full of emotion. "She left a long time ago, and I haven't heard from her since." Grace Walker felt sad for him and understood how he felt. She had lost her parents too. Grace Walker continued to work at the diner, feeling more and more at home. She spent her days helping Richard and talking with him about their lives. Even though they were from different generations, they understood each other's pain. Richard treated Grace Walker like a daughter, and she appreciated it. But Grace Walker's struggles weren't over. Even with her new job, she didn't have enough money to fix her house. Winter was coming, and she wasn't sure how she would survive the cold. One night, after work, she noticed that the house next door, which had been empty for months, now had people living in it. Grace Walker was curious and wanted to see who had moved in. She found a young girl and a young man. The girl, Lila Harper, was around 12 years old, and the man, Max Bennett, looked to be in his early 20s. They had just moved in. Grace Walker introduced herself, and Max Bennett smiled at her. He seemed tired, but friendly. She noticed there was something in his face that reminded her of her own sadness. She said goodbye and went home, but she couldn't stop thinking about them. The next morning, Grace Walker decided to help them. She went to the store and bought some bread, beans, and cheese. It wasn't much, but she hoped it would help. She walked to their house, her basket of food in hand. When she knocked, Max Bennett answered. His tired face softened when he saw the food. Grace Walker stepped inside and saw Lila Harper sitting by a sick woman in a bed. The woman looked weak, and Lila Harper looked sad. When Lila Harper saw the food, she smiled brightly and thanked Grace Walker. Grace Walker's heart warmed, knowing she had done something good. Grace Walker placed the basket on a small table and sat down next to Max Bennett. She was grateful that he started explaining what was going on, although Grace Walker had already guessed most of it. Their mother, Catherine Hale, had been very sick for many months. The family had moved to this small town hoping for a quieter life, far away from the problems they left behind. "Our dad left years ago," Max Bennett said quietly, his voice sounding a little sad. "He couldn't deal with the bills and started drinking. After that, it was just us." Grace Walker nodded, feeling sad for him. She knew all too well what it was like to lose a parent and have to keep going with very little help. "My mom needs surgery," Max Bennett continued. "The doctors say it's really important, but we don't have the money for it. I'd work if I could, but someone has to stay with Lila Harper and Mom." Grace Walker's heart felt tight as she listened. She understood the responsibility of taking care of family when there was no one else to help. For a moment, she stayed quiet, thinking hard about what she could do. "I'll help you," Grace Walker said finally, her voice full of determination, even though she wasn't sure how she could help yet. "I'll do whatever I can to make sure your mom gets the surgery she needs." Max Bennett looked at her, surprised but really thankful. "I don't know what you could do, but thank you. It really means a lot that you care." Grace Walker smiled, but her mind was already thinking of ways to help. She couldn't just stand by and do nothing. As she worked at the diner later that day, her mind kept thinking about the Duac family's problems. It felt like their lives were similar, and she couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason. For the first time in a long time, Grace Walker felt like she had a purpose, and she was determined to help. After her shift ended, with the sun setting and painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Grace Walker knew she had to do something. The Duac family was in trouble, and she felt she might be able to help. She thought for a second, and then headed to Richard Jonathan's office. Richard was an older man who owned the restaurant where Grace Walker worked. He was sitting behind his desk with a lot of papers when Grace Walker walked in. He looked up and smiled warmly. "Grace Walker, what brings you here so late?" Grace Walker took a deep breath, her hands gripping her apron. She didn't want to sound too desperate, but she knew she had to ask. "Jonathan Hale," she started, her voice a little shaky. "I need to ask you for a big favor." Richard looked at her with concern. "What is it, Grace Walker? Tell me what's going on." Grace Walker told him everything. How their mother needed surgery, how they didn't have the money, and how Max Bennett was doing his best to take care of his little sister, Lila Harper, and their sick mom. As she spoke, her voice trembled, but she kept going. "I was wondering if you could lend me the money," she said, her hands shaking. "I'll pay it back little by little with my wages. I know it's a lot to ask, but I'll do whatever it takes." Richard was silent for a while. Grace Walker's heart raced as she waited for him to answer. He had already done so much for her, giving her a job when she had no other options. Asking for more felt almost impossible, but she couldn't ignore the Duac family's need. Finally, Richard spoke. "Grace Walker," he said, his voice calm and kind, "you don't need to worry about paying me back. I've been through tough times too, and I know how hard it is when someone you love is in pain. I'll help this family, not because you asked, but because it's the right thing to do." Tears filled Grace Walker's eyes, and she couldn't stop them from falling. "Thank you," she whispered, feeling so grateful. It wasn't just the money that made her feel thankful, but Richard's kindness and understanding. He cared because it was the right thing to do. "You don't need to thank me," Richard said, standing up and placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes people meet for reasons we can't understand right away. I think you're here in this town for something greater than you know." With a heart full of hope, Grace Walker left the restaurant and ran to the Duac family's house. When she arrived, Lila Harper was sitting on the porch, looking a little worried. When she saw Grace Walker, Lila Harper called out to her, "What's wrong?" Grace Walker, out of breath from running, smiled as she reached the porch. "I found the money for your mom's surgery," she said. "She's going to be okay." Lila Harper's eyes grew wide with surprise, and then she jumped into Grace Walker's arms, holding on tight. "Really? Is it true?" she asked, her voice full of excitement. Just then, Max Bennett came outside, looking tired and worried. When he saw the happy look on Lila Harper's face and the tears in Grace Walker's eyes, he asked carefully, "Is it true? Did you really?" Grace Walker nodded, her voice steady. "Jonathan Hale is taking care of everything." Max Bennett's face softened, and for the first time, his tired eyes seemed to sparkle with hope. The house, which had felt so heavy with sadness, now seemed lighter. Grace Walker left feeling lighter too, her heart full of hope. The future didn't seem as dark anymore. Over the next few days, everything moved quickly. The hospital confirmed they had received the money, and the surgery was scheduled without delay. Grace Walker noticed that when she saw Max Bennett and Lila Harper, they looked a little bit brighter. Even though they were still worried, they had hope now. The morning before the surgery, Grace Walker stopped by the Duac house again, just to make sure everything was ready. Elaine Bennett was outside on the porch, looking stressed but also a little hopeful. "How are you holding up?" Grace Walker asked, sitting next to him. Elaine Bennett sighed. "I'm relieved, but also nervous. Everything is happening so fast. I can't believe it's real. I don't know if we can really get through this." Grace Walker nodded. "It's real, Elaine Bennett. Your mom is going to get the care she needs. It's still going to be hard, but things can get better." Elaine Bennett looked at her, his eyes full of gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you, Grace Walker. If it weren't for you, I don't know what we would have done. We barely know each other, and yet you've already changed our lives." Grace Walker smiled softly. "You don't need to thank me. We all go through hard times, and helping each other is what we should do." They sat in quiet peace for a moment, watching the view of the rolling hills and listening to the birds. Lila Harper came out and asked, "Is everything ready for Elaine Bennett?" Grace Walker smiled and nodded. "Everything's ready. Your mom will be taken to the hospital in the morning, and the doctors will take care of everything." Lila Harper sat next to Grace Walker, resting her head on her shoulder. Even though she was young, Lila Harper understood how serious it was. Grace Walker had become someone Lila Harper could rely on, and in turn, Grace Walker realized that she needed Lila Harper just as much. It was like finding family again. The next morning, when the sun was just starting to rise, the family headed to the hospital. They didn't have their own car, but a kind neighbor offered to drive them in his old truck. The ride was long and quiet, except for the sound of the truck engine. When they arrived at the hospital, it was big and busy, very different from their small town. Doctors and nurses quickly took charge of Elaine Bennett's mom, and the waiting felt like it would never end. Elaine Bennett held his mom's hand, looking worried, and Lila Harper stayed close to Grace Walker. In the afternoon, as the sun began to set, a doctor came out. He looked serious, but there was a hint of good news in his eyes. "The surgery was successful," he said. "Your mom needs rest, but she has a good chance of fully recovering." Elaine Bennett, Lila Harper, and Grace Walker all stood up, their hearts racing. They could hardly believe it. After so many weeks of worrying, they finally felt relief. Elaine Bennett quickly shook the doctor's hand, tears filling his eyes. Thank you so much," he said. Lila Harper and Grace Walker hugged, their tears of joy matching each other's. Though they still had a long road ahead, they felt that a huge burden had been lifted. Over the next few days, Elaine Bennett and Lila Harper visited their mom at the hospital every day. Grace Walker continued working at Richard Jonathan's restaurant. He often asked how their mom was doing, and his kind words made Grace Walker feel cared for. One evening, after work, Richard called Grace Walker into his office. "Grace Walker," he said, looking through some papers, "I want to thank you. Because of you, this family has a second chance. If you hadn't stepped in, things might have turned out very differently." Grace Walker blushed, feeling surprised. "I just did what I thought was right," she said quietly. Richard smiled gently. "I know, but sometimes doing the right thing makes all the difference." Grace Walker was sitting in a chair, listening to Richard talk. He leaned back and said, "Sometimes people come into our lives for reasons we don't understand right away. In your case, I don't think it's a coincidence that you ended up in this town or that you found my wallet when you did." Grace Walker felt a chill go down her spine when she heard his words. They made her feel something deep inside, but she didn't know why. "Maybe," she said, not sure what else to say. Richard smiled, but didn't say anything more. They sat quietly, trusting that time would help them understand everything. A few days later, as Grace Walker was finishing her shift at the restaurant, Max Bennett rushed in. He looked worried. He came straight to Grace Walker and asked, "Can we talk?" His voice was breathless, like he had been running. Grace Walker nodded and led him to a quiet spot in the back of the restaurant. "What's wrong, Max Bennett?" she asked. He took a deep breath and pulled out an old photograph. It was a picture of a young couple, smiling on what looked like their wedding day. The woman looked happy, and the man had a proud look on his face. "This is the only picture my mom gave me before her surgery," Max Bennett explained. "She kept it for years, but she never told me who the man in the photo was. She said he was someone important in her past." Grace Walker looked closely at the photo. She recognized the woman as Max Bennett's mother, but the man looked familiar. She felt a strange feeling in her heart. She asked, "Have you shown this picture to anyone else?" "No," Max Bennett said. "I thought about asking my mom more, but she was too sick. I think the man in the picture matters somehow, though." Grace Walker felt something in her gut. "I think you should show it to Richard Jonathan," she said softly. Max Bennett was puzzled. "Why? Do you think he knows him?" "I'm not sure," Grace Walker replied. "But there's something about that man in the photo. He feels familiar to me, and I can't stop thinking about what Richard said to me the other day. It might be worth asking him." Max Bennett hesitated but agreed. "Okay, I'll talk to him." The next day, after a long night full of thoughts about the photo, Max Bennett decided to go to Richard's restaurant. Grace Walker had told him to follow his instincts, and he felt like he had to do it. When he arrived at the busy restaurant, he saw Richard sitting at the counter, doing his usual work. Richard looked up when the door opened and smiled. "Max Bennett, how's your mom doing?" Richard asked, his voice full of care. "She's better, Jonathan Hale," Max Bennett said with a smile. He then took out the photograph and showed it to Richard. At first, Richard seemed curious, but as he looked at the photo, his face changed. His hands started to shake, and his eyes filled with shock and emotion. "This photo," Richard whispered, his voice trembling. "It can't be." Max Bennett watched, confused, as Richard stared at the picture. "Do you know the woman in this photo?" Max Bennett asked carefully. Richard's eyes filled with tears. "I know her very well, son. She's my daughter, Catherine Hale." Max Bennett froze. His mind couldn't understand what he was hearing. Richard explained that Catherine Hale had left home many years ago after a big argument and married a man he couldn't accept. He searched for her for years, but never found her. "Is that man in the photo my father?" Max Bennett asked, his voice full of wonder. Richard nodded slowly. "Yes. I didn't see him much, but I always regretted not supporting Catherine Hale. After she left, I never gave up hope that I would hear from her again." Max Bennett tried to understand everything, and his mind was spinning. "So, Lila Harper and I, were your grandchildren?" Richard's face softened, and tears fell down his cheeks. He stood up, walked over to Max Bennett, and hugged him tightly. "That's right, son. I can hardly believe it. After all these years, I've found my daughter, and now I have my grandchildren." The two of them held each other for a long time. It was a moment full of emotion and shock. It was a moment that changed their lives forever. The next afternoon, Richard decided to visit his daughter, Catherine Hale, at the hospital. Grace Walker, who had always been there for the Jonathan family, wanted to go with them. Richard was nervous. He didn't know how Catherine Hale would feel about seeing him after all these years. But they all walked to her room together. When they reached the door, Richard hesitated, taking a deep breath to gather his courage. Grace Walker squeezed his arm gently and smiled. "It's going to be okay," she whispered. Richard opened the door slowly, and there, lying in the hospital bed, was Catherine Hale. She looked weak, but when her eyes met Richard's, something in her face changed. She looked surprised and said, "Dad?" Richard's heart filled with emotion. He walked over to her, took her hand, and said, "Catherine Hale, my sweet girl, I've waited so long for this. I've missed you so much." Catherine Hale cried, holding her father's hand. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I'm sorry for leaving you like I did." Richard shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "None of that matters now. The only thing that matters is that we're together again." Grace Walker, Max Bennett, and Lila Harper, standing in the doorway, couldn't hold back their tears. After so many years of pain and distance, the family was finally back together. In the days after Catherine Hale's surgery, she was getting better. Richard, who had never left her side, decided it was time for her, Max Bennett, and Lila Harper to move into his home. It wasn't big, but it had enough room for all of them. "This is where we'll start fresh," Richard said, helping Catherine Hale settle into her new room. "We've lost so much time, but I'm determined to make up for it." Catherine Hale looked at her father, filled with gratitude. "Thank you for never giving up on me, Dad," she said softly. Richard took her hand gently and said, "I've always loved you, Catherine Hale. I always will. What matters now is that we're together." Catherine Hale, Richard, Max Bennett, and Lila Harper began to heal their hearts, learning to love and trust again. The small town of Bedford Falls was changing too. The neighbors, who had once watched the family from a distance, now saw them in a new light. They offered their help and support, knowing that love can heal even the deepest wounds. Grace Walker had become close with the Jonathan family, and her bond with Max Bennett grew stronger every day. They had been through so much together, and it felt like they were meant to be a part of each other's lives. One sunny day, Max Bennett and Grace Walker were walking through the fields when Max Bennett stopped and turned to her with a warm smile. "I don't know where we'd be without you, Grace Walker," he said. "You didn't just give us hope, you gave us a new chance at life." Grace Walker smiled. "You and your family did the same for me," she said. "Before I met you, I was all alone. Helping you felt like helping myself. I'm so glad I could be here for you." Max Bennett gently took Grace Walker's hand, and their fingers naturally intertwined. "I can't imagine my life without you," he said, his voice full of love. "You've been a light in our darkest moments." Grace Walker felt her heart race, but it wasn't from nervousness. It was because she knew that what was happening between them was real and deep. "I can't imagine a future without you either," she whispered, smiling. A year after Catherine Hale's surgery, Grace Walker and Max Bennett got married. The whole town was excited. It was a small wedding at the church, with flowers from the hills outside. Richard, who had become like a father to Grace Walker, walked her down the aisle. It was a special moment for him. When Grace Walker and Max Bennett were finally married, the whole community celebrated. Later, Richard gave a speech at the reception. He spoke about how life had brought them all together. "Sometimes, life pulls us apart, but it also brings us back together," he said, his voice full of emotion. "Grace Walker, you've been a blessing to all of us." Everyone cheered, and Grace Walker felt so thankful for everything she had. She was part of this family now, a family that had taught her that love can change everything. In the end, the Jonathan family, once filled with sadness and loss, had found strength in each other. They had triumphed over hardship with love and hope. And Grace Walker, who had once felt completely alone, had found her place in a family that she never expected. Together, they all built a future full of love and happiness. Life in Bedford Falls had changed, and it was better than anyone could have dreamed. If you enjoyed this story and would like to see more content like it, I encourage you to subscribe to my channel. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on all our latest, inspiring, and heartwarming stories, and have the opportunity to engage with our growing community. Additionally, I would love to hear your thoughts and feedback in the comment section below. Thank you for your support, and I look forward to sharing more captivating narratives with you.